The moon hung low over the Saronic Gulf, casting silver ribbons across water that would soon run red with the consequences of deception. In the command tent, pitched on the rocky shores of Salamis, Themistocles stood alone, his weathered hands pressed against a rough wooden table scattered with crude maps drawn on sheepskin. The oil lamps flickered, throwing dancing shadows across his angular face. A face that had seen 40 summers, each one carving deeper lines around eyes that burned with an intelligence both feared and revered throughout the Hellenic world. He could hear the murmur of 10,000 Greek sailors beyond the canvas walls, their voices carrying the tremor of men who knew tomorrow might be their last dawn. The combined fleet of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and a dozen other city-states lay anchored in the protected waters behind Salamis Island. 370 triremes that represented the final defense of Greek civilization itself. Against them, the Persian armada, commanded by the god King Xerxes, numbered more than 1,000 warships, a forest of masts and oars that darkened the horizon like a plague of locusts descending upon a harvest field. Themistocles closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment of doubt, one heartbeat of pure human fear. The weight of what he was about to do pressed upon his shoulders like the entire Acropolis. He was gambling not just with his own life, but with the future of every free Greek who drew breath. If his plan failed, there would be no second chance. Athens was already ashes. Sparta would fall within months. The dream of democracy, of citizens ruling themselves rather than bowing to divine kings, would be extinguished like a candle flame in a storm. Then he opened his eyes again, and the doubt was gone, transformed into the cold calculation that had made him Athens' most dangerous strategist. "It has to work," he whispered to the empty tent. "There is no other way." Outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. Themistocles straightened, his expression settling into the mask of confidence he had worn for so long it had nearly become his true face. The tent flap parted, and Mnesophilis entered, his old teacher, now bent with age but still sharp as a Spartan blade. Behind him came Eurybiades, the Spartan admiral who commanded the allied fleet in name, though everyone knew the true architect of their defense stood before them now. "The council is in chaos," Eurybiades announced without preamble. His Spartan accent clipped each word short, as if language itself was an enemy to be defeated with economy of force. "Let them talk," Themistocles said quietly, moving to pour wine from a clay amphora. His hands were steady despite the enormity of what he had set in motion. Mnesophilis shuffled forward, his rheumy eyes reflecting the lamplight. The old philosopher had taught Themistocles everything about strategy, about reading men's hearts and manipulating their fears. Now he studied his former student with the intensity of someone trying to see behind a carefully constructed facade. "You've made your decision, then. You'll send the message." "I already have." The silence that followed was profound. Eurybiades' hand moved instinctively towards his sword hilt, though he did not draw. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "What have you done?" Themistocles moved to the tent entrance and pulled back the flap, gesturing toward the dark water beyond. Somewhere out there, beyond the straits, the Persian fleet rested at anchor in the bay of Phaleron. Somewhere in that vast armada, a single small boat was approaching, a fishing vessel bearing the slave whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of freedom and gold. "Sakinis," Themistocles said, speaking the name of his most trusted household slave. "He carries a message for Xerxes, a message that will save Greece or doom us all."
Eurybiades took 3 steps forward, close enough that Themistocles could smell the salt spray on his armor, see the fury building in his eyes. You sent a message to the enemy without consulting the council, without giving cowards a chance to stop me. Yes. Themistocles turned to face the Spartan fully, his own voice hardening to match his. If I had brought this to the council, we would have debated until Xerxes died of old age. Meanwhile, his scouts would have detected our ships fleeing south, and he would have picked us off one by one in open water, where his numbers and his archers would slaughter us. So instead, you've betrayed our position to him directly. No. I've given him exactly what his pride demands, the illusion of control, the belief that he is the hunter, when in reality he is the prey. Mnesophilis raised a gnarled hand, forestalling Eurybiades' next outburst. Explain, boy. All of it. Leave nothing out. And so Themistocles told them. 3 hours earlier, Sikinus had knelt before Themistocles in the darkness of a storage cave carved into Salamis's rocky interior. The Persian-born slave had served the Athenian strategist for 15 years, had taught Themistocles' sons their letters, had become more family than servant. Now his weathered face showed the weight of what was being asked of him. The cave smelled of damp stone and old wine, illuminated only by a single oil lamp that made their shadows dance on ancient walls. Outside, the sound of the sea was a constant presence, waves crashing against rocks that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations older than Troy. You understand what you must tell them, Themistocles had asked, gripping Sikinus by both shoulders, his voice low and urgent. Sikinus nodded slowly, his dark eyes meeting his master's without flinching. I am to say that you, Themistocles of Athens, wish to defect to the Persian side, that you are weary of Greek squabbling and see the futility of resistance, that you send this message as proof of your sincerity. And the key detail, that the Greek fleet is divided, that the commanders argue through the night, and that by morning they will scatter like leaves before wind, that if Xerxes wishes to prevent their escape and destroy them utterly, he must act immediately, tonight, by surrounding the straits and trapping the Greeks in these waters. Themistocles had studied the old man's face, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. You will question you. They may torture you. Persian interrogators are skilled at extracting truth from lies. If you reveal the deception, if you break under pressure, then Greece falls, your family dies, and I am sold back into slavery or executed regardless. Sikinus had finished calmly, his voice carrying the acceptance of one who had made peace with fate. I understand the stakes, master, better than you know. You were born in Persia. You speak their language without accent. You know their customs, their way of thinking. Themistocles' grip tightened on the slave's shoulders. That's why this must be you. That's why I'm asking you to walk into the lion's den and convince the lion that you are his friend. Sikinus smiled then, a sad expression that spoke of resignation and something deeper, perhaps pride, in being chosen for such a crucial role. I am not your master tonight, Themistocles. Tonight, you offer me something no master ever has, the chance to choose my own fate, to decide that my life means something beyond servitude. Tonight, I am not a slave. I am an Athenian defending my city. Themistocles had felt something catch in his throat, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. If we succeed, when we succeed, you will be free, more than free. You will be honored. Your name will be remembered. And if we fail, At least I will die knowing I was part of something greater than myself." Sakina's head straightened, squaring his shoulders. "The tide turns in an hour. I should go. Persian sentries will be less alert in the dead watch between midnight and dawn, when even soldiers fight against sleep." They had embraced briefly, wordlessly. In that moment, the distinction between master and servant dissolved, leaving only two men who understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. Then Sakinas had gathered his cloak, checked the small purse of Persian coins that would lend credibility to his story, and disappeared into the darkness. Themistocles had watched him go, a solitary figure rowing a small boat toward the vast Persian anchorage, carrying a lie that either would become Greece's deliverance or its final epitaph.
For long minutes after the boat disappeared into the night, Themistocles had stood at the cave entrance, listening to the sea and wondering if he had just sent a friend to his death for nothing. But there was no room for doubt now. The dice had been cast. The message was on its way. All that remained was to see how Xerxes would respond. Now, standing in his command tent with Eurybiades and Mnesopheles staring at him with expressions mingling horror and reluctant admiration, Themistocles explained the full scope of his gambit. "Xerxes is confident," he said, his voice steady and certain as he moved back to the map table. His finger traced the outline of the straits, showing them the geography that would determine the fate of nations. "His army has burned Athens. His navy outnumbers ours 3-1. He has crushed every force that dared oppose him from the Hellespont to Thermopylae. But confidence breeds caution. The paradox of power is that the more you have, the more you fear losing it." "So you've decided to feed his confidence?" Eurybiades demanded, though his anger was giving way to curiosity, "to make him even more certain of victory?" "No, I've given him what he wants most, a quick, decisive end to this war. He fears we will escape, that this conflict will drag on for years as we harry his supply lines and retreat whenever he advances. His empire is vast, but it is also fragile. He cannot afford to leave his army in Greece indefinitely. Satraps grow ambitious, rivals plot. Every month he spends here is a month his grip on power weakens back in Susa and Persepolis." Themistocles picked up a handful of small stones from the table, arranging them to represent ships. "So I've told him exactly how to trap us, how to achieve the crushing victory he craves. I've made it seem easy, inevitable. And because men see what they wish to see, because his scouts will confirm that we are indeed divided and arguing, because most of his council genuinely wants to flee, he will believe every word." "And when he moves to surround us," Mnesopheles asked quietly, beginning to understand, "then he will position his fleet exactly where I want it, crowded into these narrow channels where his superior numbers become meaningless, unable to maneuver, unable to bring his archers to bear effectively, forced to fight in conditions that favor our heavier ships and our superior ramming tactics." Eurybiades studied the map, his tactical mind working through the implications. Slowly, very slowly, his expression changed from anger to something approaching awe. "The straits." "The straits," Themistocles confirmed, allowing himself a thin smile. "In open water, we die. Persian ships are faster, more maneuverable. Their archers can fill the sky with arrows while staying beyond the range of our javelins. Their numbers allow them to surround and overwhelm us. But here, in these narrow passages between Salamis and the mainland, here, perhaps 1/10 of their fleet can engage at any given time. Here, their vast armada becomes not an advantage, but a liability." He picked up more stones, crowding them together in the narrow space representing the strait. "They will be packed so tightly they cannot row effectively. Ships will collide with their own allies. Orders shouted in a dozen different languages, Phoenician, Egyptian, Ionian, Cilician, will create chaos. And while they struggle in confusion, we will drive into them like a spear into an unarmored belly, our bronze rams shattering their hulls one after another."
"You're forcing him to fight where his strengths become weaknesses," Eurybiades said slowly, his Spartan pragmatism recognizing the brutal logic of the strategy. "You're making him think it's his own idea to walk into a trap." More than that, Themistocles leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I'm giving him no choice. By morning, when he realizes what I've done, it will be too late to withdraw. His fleet will be committed. His pride, and the pride of every Persian noble watching from the shore, will demand that he finish what he started. He cannot appear weak before his own subjects. So even if he suspects deception, even if doubt creeps into his mind, he will push forward, because to retreat would be to admit error, to show vulnerability, to plant seeds of rebellion across his empire." Mnesopheles nodded slowly, a smile crossing his ancient features. "You've trapped him psychologically as much as tactically. The straits are a physical cage, but pride is the lock that will keep him there." "Exactly." Themistocles straightened, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But understand this, I am gambling everything on my reading of one man's character. If Xerxes is more cautious than I believe, if he suspects the trap and withdraws, then we are left exactly where we started, outnumbered, demoralized, waiting for inevitable defeat. If he is more reckless than I expect, if he simply sends wave after wave of ships through the strait until we are overwhelmed by sheer attrition, we still lose." "And if he doesn't believe Sisychanes at all?" Eurybiades asked quietly. Themistocles met the Spartan's eyes without flinching. "Then Sisychanes dies screaming, and we die tomorrow. But I don't think that will happen. The message contains just enough truth to be credible. We are divided, that much is obvious to anyone with eyes. Many commanders do want to flee. Our Sown scouts can confirm it. The only lie is my supposed desire to defect, and even that is plausible. I'm known as a manipulator, a schemer, someone who puts survival above honor. Why wouldn't I try to save myself by betraying my allies?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "The perfect lie is one that confirms what the listener already believes. Xerxes sees me as a rat who will abandon a sinking ship. So when I offer to do exactly that, he will believe it because it matches his understanding of my character." The three men stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the gambit settling over them like a heavy cloak. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued, men sharpening weapons, checking oar straps, saying prayers to gods who seemed very far away tonight. Finally, Eurybiades spoke. "If this works, Themistocles, you will have saved Greece through the most audacious deception in the history of warfare. If it fails—" He left the sentence unfinished. "If it fails, it won't matter what anyone thinks of me. We'll all be dead or enslaved." Themistocles moved to the wine amphora again, pouring 3 cups. "But it will work. It has to work, because the alternative is unthinkable." They drank in silence, 3 men who understood that by dawn they would either be heroes or corpses. There was nothing more to say. The plan was in motion. Now came the hardest part of any strategy, waiting to see if fate and fortune would favor the bold.
In the Persian camp at Phaleron, the message had indeed arrived. Sisinus was brought before Xerxes himself, the god-king who ruled an empire stretching from India to Egypt, from the Black Sea to the Arabian desert. The Persian court was a riot of color and splendor, even in the depths of night. Silk pavilions painted with scenes of ancient victories, golden braziers burning perfumed wood that filled the air with exotic scents, guards in scaled armor that caught the firelight like dragon skin. Xerxes sat upon a portable throne of carved ivory inlaid with lapis lazuli and gold, his dark eyes studying the Greek slave with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. He was younger than most realized, barely 30, but he carried himself with the absolute certainty of one who had never been refused anything in his life. His beard was oiled and braided in the Persian fashion, his robes were purple silk embroidered with golden thread, and upon his head sat the crown of conquered nations, a diadem incorporating symbols from Egypt, Babylonia, Media, and a dozen other lands that had bent the knee to Persian might.
Around him stood his advisors, a collection of the most powerful men in the known world. Mardonius, the grizzled general who had commanded the sack of Athens, his hands still bearing burns from torching the temples on the Acropolis. Artemisia, the warrior queen of Halicarnassus, whose presence in a male-dominated war council was testament to her ruthlessness and tactical brilliance. Ariabignes, the king's own admiral of the fleet, still wearing his sea-stained armor from the day's maneuvers. And others, satraps and nobles, priests and spies, all waiting to hear what news this Greek slave brought in the dead of night. "You claim your master wishes to betray his people," Xerxes said in flawless Greek, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of divine right. "Tell me, slave, why should I believe a word from your mouth? Why shouldn't I assume this is some crude attempt at deception?" Sisinus kept his eyes lowered, his posture submissive, every gesture calculated to show deference and fear. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times during the row across dark water, had prepared himself for every possible question, every potential trap. His life and the fate of Greece depended on his performance now. "Great king, light of the world, chosen of Ahura Mazda," he began, using the formal titles that Persian protocol demanded. "I bring not just words, but truth that can be verified. Themistocles knows Athens is lost. He watched it burn from these very shores. He knows the Greeks cannot win. He has seen your army's might, counted your ships, understood the futility of resistance. He is a practical man, great king, not given to romantic notions of heroic last stands." "So he seeks to preserve himself." Xerxes leaned forward slightly, interested despite his skepticism. "He seeks to preserve his family, his wealth, his future. He has children, great king, 3 sons and 2 daughters. In Athens, they would face slavery or death when the final conquest comes. But if he serves you, if he helps you achieve the quick victory you desire, then perhaps there is a place for him in your empire. Perhaps his sons could serve as administrators, his daughters married to Persian nobles. This is what any wise man seeks when he knows the tide of history cannot be turned." It was a masterful appeal, Sisinus knew, because it cast Themistocles' supposed betrayal not as cowardice but as pragmatism. Persian nobles respected cunning and self-preservation. A man who blindly fought to the death was brave but foolish. A man who recognized reality and adapted to it, that was someone who could be useful, could be trusted to act in his own interests, which meant he could be predicted and controlled. Artemisia stepped forward, her armor creaking softly. She was perhaps 40, her face marked by sun and wind and the scars of a dozen sea battles. Her eyes, dark and calculating, fixed on Sisinus with an intensity that made him want to look away. "It could be a trap," she said in Persian, though Sisinus understood every word from his childhood. "The Greeks are desperate. Desperate men lie convincingly because they have nothing left to lose." "What lies could serve them?" Mardonius countered, his voice rough as grinding stone. "We have already won. Athens is ashes. Their army is scattered. Their navy cowers behind this island waiting for death. Even if this message is false, what harm does it do us to act on it? We were planning to attack anyway. The slave's message simply tells us when and where they are most vulnerable." "Precisely my concern," Artemisia insisted. "If it seems too convenient, too perfect, then perhaps it is neither convenient nor perfect, but rather a snare designed to look like opportunity." Xerxes raised a hand, silencing the debate. He addressed Sisinus directly again, switching back to Greek. "You say Themistocles sends proof of his sincerity. What proof? What can you offer beyond words that could be lies wrapped in the appearance of truth?" This was the moment Sisinus had most dreaded and most prepared for.
Great king, I offer no proof except this. Send your own scouts to observe the Greek camp. You will see the commanders arguing on the beaches, their voices raised in anger. You will see ships preparing for departure, crews making ready for departure. You will see exactly what I have told you, a fleet divided, terrified, on the verge of collapse. All I ask is that you verify my words with your own eyes before making any decision. It was a brilliant gambit within a gambit. By inviting verification, Sisinus made the message seem genuine. And because the Greeks genuinely were divided, because most of the council really did want to flee, Persian scouts would confirm everything he said. The only deception was in the interpretation. What looked like preparation for flight was actually Themistocles' manipulation of his own allies to create credible cover for the larger deception. Xerxes considered this, his expression unreadable. Around him, his advisors maintained careful silence, each acutely aware that kings in contemplation were dangerous to interrupt. Finally, the god-king spoke a single word in Persian. Go. 3 officers hurried from the tent, selected for their speed and stealth. They would take swift boats, approach the Greek positions under cover of darkness, observe and report. Within 2 hours, they would return with intelligence that would determine whether Sisinus lived or died, whether Persia pressed its advantage or withdrew to reconsider. While they waited, Sisinus was kept under guard in a small tent, given water but no food, watched by men whose hands never strayed far from their weapons. He sat in silence, controlling his breathing, refusing to let fear show on his face. In his mind, he recited the poetry his master's children had learned, the verses of Homer and Hesiod that spoke of heroes and gods, of men who faced impossible odds and somehow prevailed. Time stretched like taffy, each moment an eternity. But finally, the scouts returned. They entered Xerxes' pavilion with the urgency of men bearing important news. Great king, the lead scout reported, everything the slaves said is true. The Greek camp is in chaos. We heard commanders shouting at each other. The Spartans want to retreat south. The Corinthians want to scatter. The Athenians are divided between those who want revenge and those who want survival. Ships are being provisioned as if for immediate departure. There is no unity, no coherent strategy, just fear and confusion. Mardonius smiled, a predatory expression. Then we have them. If we move tonight to surround the straits, we trap them before they can flee. By dawn they will wake to find themselves caged, and by noon tomorrow the war will be over. Artemisia remained skeptical, but even she could not argue with verified intelligence. If we do this, we must commit fully. Half measures will allow them to escape or regroup. We must block every exit, position our fastest ships to intercept any who try to run, and have the main fleet ready to sweep through at first light. Ariabignes unrolled a map on a low table, his admiral mind already working through logistics. The straits between Salamis and the mainland are perhaps 2 kilometers wide at the narrowest point. We would need to position squadrons here at the western exit and here at the eastern approach to ensure no Greek ship escapes. The main fleet would remain here in the Bay of Phaleron, ready to advance at dawn. How many ships can we fit through the Narrows at once?
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Perhaps 60, 70 at most without losing formation and discipline. But that should be sufficient. We can rotate fresh squadrons into battle while the Greeks exhaust themselves. We have the numbers to sustain combat indefinitely. They do not. And they have 370 ships to our 1,000, Xerxes mused. Even trapped, they could fight fiercely if they choose courage over sense. Trapped animals are dangerous. Artemisia agreed. But they are also predictable. They will panic, they will break formation, and when they do, we will slaughter them. Xerxes sat in silence for a long moment, weighing the decision that would determine the fate of his invasion. In truth, the choice had already been made. The strategic logic was too compelling, the opportunity too perfect. But kings did not simply make decisions. They performed them, displayed them, turned them into demonstrations of wisdom and power. "It is decided," he finally proclaimed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We move tonight. Ariabignes, you will command the fleet's deployment. Mardonius, position troops on the mainland shores to intercept any Greeks who make it to land. By dawn, the Greeks will be trapped. By sunset tomorrow, the war will be over, and Greece will bow to Persian rule as is proper and inevitable." The advisors bowed and began to disperse, each moving to implement their part of the operation. Guards and messengers hurried out to spread the word. Within the hour, the vast Persian fleet would be in motion, 1,000 ships moving under cover of darkness to surround and destroy the Greek navy. As the council broke up, Artemisia lingered. She approached Sisinus, who had been brought back to hear the verdict. Her dark eyes studied him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met, or the most loyal. I cannot decide which. But I know this: if you have deceived us, if this message is a trick, then the man who sent you is a genius. And if it is not, if you truly have betrayed your people, then you are a coward who deserves contempt even as we use you." She paused, her expression unreadable. "Pray to your gods that you are fortunate, because clever plans often require good fortune to succeed, and fortune is the one thing no amount of intelligence can guarantee." Then she, too, was gone, leaving Sisinus alone with his guards and the terrible knowledge that the greatest gambit in Greek history was now in motion. The trap was set. Now came the question of who exactly had been trapped. Dawn broke over Salamis with a beauty that seemed almost cruel. The sky blazed crimson and gold, painting the waters in shades of fire and blood. Fishermen might have called it a shepherd's warning. Red sky in morning, sailors take warning. But there were no fishermen on these waters today, only warriors preparing for a battle that would determine the future of Western civilization. On the Greek ships, men emerged from fitful sleep to discover what Themistocles had known they would find. They were surrounded. During the night, Persian vessels had positioned themselves at both ends of the strait like the jaws of a trap closing. To the west, where the channel opened toward the Gulf of Elefsina, a line of Phoenician warships blocked all passage, their crews alert and ready. To the east, Egyptian and Sicilian squadrons sealed the approach, their oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm as they maintained position. And beyond them, visible in the growing light of dawn, the massive Persian fleet waited in the open water, a forest of masts that seemed to stretch to infinity. More ships than any Greek had ever seen assembled in one place. There would be no retreat, no escape, no running away to fight another day. The trap had closed, but not in the way most Greeks believed. On the beach at Salamis, panic spread like wildfire through dry grass. Captains and commanders gathered in angry knots, voices raised in fear and accusation. Some blamed Themistocles for luring them here. Others blamed Eurybiades for failing to order a retreat days ago.
Still others blamed the gods themselves for abandoning Greece to Persian vengeance. On the deck of his trireme, the Perologus, Themistocles stood at the prow and watched the Persian dispositions with grim satisfaction. Every squadron was positioned exactly where he had hoped, exactly where they would be most vulnerable. The Phoenicians in the west, crowding together in the narrow passage. The Egyptians in the east, their lighter ships ill-suited for ramming combat. And the main fleet in the bay, waiting to advance into waters that would become a killing ground for anyone foolish enough to enter. Everything was unfolding according to plan. Now came the harder part, convincing his fellow Greeks to fight rather than despair. The war council assembled on the beach as the sun climbed higher, its heat already beginning to burn away the morning mist. The commanders were in chaos, some demanding an immediate breakout attempt, others calling for negotiation, still others simply standing in stunned silence as they realized the magnitude of what faced them. These were the leaders of Greek city-states, men accustomed to authority and respect, but in this moment they looked like children who had suddenly realized the monster under the bed was real. Eurybiades tried to call for order, his Spartan voice sharp as bronze, but it was drowned in the cacophony. The Corinthian admiral, Adimantus, was shouting about betrayal, his face purple with rage. The Megarian captain blamed Athens for bringing disaster upon them all, his finger stabbing accusingly toward the Athenian contingent. The representatives from smaller city-states, Aegina, Epidaurus, Trozen, looked to their more powerful neighbors for guidance and found only confusion and despair. Then Themistocles stepped forward. He did not shout, he did not plead or gesticulate wildly like the others, he simply began to speak, his voice cutting through the noise with an authority that demanded attention. A calmness that stood in contrast to the panic surrounding him. "Gentlemen," he said, and the word carried across the beach with unexpected power. "We are trapped here. There is no denying this. The Persians have surrounded us, and escape is impossible." The council fell silent, every eye fixed on him. Some looks carried hatred, others showed fear, but all held attention, because in moments of crisis, men instinctively turn toward those who appear to have answers, even if those answers might be lies. "But I tell you this," he continued, his voice never rising, but somehow filling the space with certainty. "We are not trapped here by Persian cleverness. We are trapped here by my design." The silence deepened, becoming absolute. Somewhere a seabird cried, the sound sharp and lonely. Waves lapped against hulls with soft, rhythmic persistence, and every Greek commander stood frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. "Last night," Themistocles said, his words measured and clear, "I sent my most trusted servant to Xerxes with a false message. I told the Persian king that we were divided, which is true, as anyone with ears can confirm. I told him we planned to flee, which many of you genuinely wished to do. And I told him that he could trap us here and win a great victory if he moved immediately to surround these waters." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "And he believed me, because men see what they wish to see, because his pride demanded that he see himself as clever, as the hunter rather than the hunted, because I gave him exactly what his strategic situation demanded, a quick, decisive victory that would allow him to end this war and return to his empire before winter closes the mountain passes. "You've doomed us," Adamantus shouted, his voice breaking with fury and fear. "You've trapped us with no way out. You've murdered every man here with your scheming."
The bronze bell tolled across the Shang capital of Yin, its deep reverberations cutting through the morning mist like a blade through silk. In the shadow of the great oracle bone temple, a young woman named Lian pressed her forehead against the cool earth, her fingers digging into soil stained dark with centuries of ritual sacrifice. Around her, thousands knelt in the same position, farmers with calloused hands, craftsmen with bent backs, slaves with hollow eyes. They had been there since before dawn, waiting for their god-king to emerge and speak the will of heaven. But Lian was not praying. She was counting. 17 families had disappeared from the western quarter in the past month. 43 names scratched into oracle bones, offered to the ancestors in exchange for rain that never came. 128 days since her brother had been taken to the palace foundries, promised 3 meals, and returned to her as ash in a ceramic jar. The priests had told her it was an honor, that his spirit now served the divine king Dai Sin in the realm beyond death, that heaven had chosen him. Lian had stopped believing in heaven the day she buried that jar. The crowd stirred as the temple doors groaned open. Lian raised her head just enough to see the procession emerge. Priests in robes of crimson and gold, carrying staffs topped with bronze faces of ancient spirits. Behind them came the royal guard, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their faces as expressionless as the metal they wore. And then, finally, Dai Sin himself. The king of Shang was not what travelers' tales suggested. He was not a monster with fangs and claws, not a demon draped in human skin. He was simply a man, middle-aged, with a beard trimmed to aristocratic precision, his robes embroidered with dragons that seemed to writhe in the morning light. But it was his eyes that made Lian's blood run cold. They held the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no, never been denied, never been questioned. They were the eyes of a man who believed himself a god. "Children of heaven," Dai Sin's voice carried across the plaza without effort, trained from birth to command. "The spirits speak to me in dreams. They show me visions of prosperity, of conquest, of an empire that will span from the eastern sea to the western mountains. But the ancestors demand tribute. They hunger for devotion. They require proof of our faith." Lian felt the woman beside her begin to tremble. Her name was May, mother of 3, wife of a potter who had spoken too loudly at the market about the grain shortages. They had come for him 2 days ago. "The bronze for our weapons, the copper for our bells, the tin for our vessels, these gifts must be cast in the sacred fires. The foundries require skilled hands. The ancestors require worthy souls. Those who labor in the divine workshops walk closest to heaven itself." It was a beautiful lie wrapped in silk and ceremony. Lian had seen the foundries from a distance, great pyres that burned night and day, fed by prisoners, debtors, and anyone who dared question the king's divine mandate. The bronze vessels crafted there were indeed magnificent, intricate works that depicted gods and heroes in stunning detail. But Lian knew the cost of each curve and character. She knew because she had washed her brother's clothes when he returned from his first week of labor, finding his hands blistered and bleeding, his lungs rattling with each breath from the toxic fumes. She knew because the clothes she washed before he died
had been more blood than fabric. "Lord Chancellor Began will collect the names of volunteers," Dai Sin announced. A ripple of fear passed through the crowd like wind through wheat. No one volunteered for the foundries. You were volunteered. "Serve heaven, and heaven will remember your bloodline forever." As the king retreated into his temple, the crowd began to disperse in anxious silence. Lian stood slowly, her legs numb from kneeling, and helped May to her feet. The older woman's face was wet with silent tears. "They will take my children next," May whispered. "I have no husband to protect them, no family with influence. They will take them, and they will call it service." Lian opened her mouth to offer comfort, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? That the gods were merciful? That justice existed? That heaven watched over the righteous? She had believed those things once, when she was younger and foolish, before she understood that heaven only watched over kings. "Come," Lian said instead, taking May's arm. "Let us find food. The market may still have—" "You there! The tall one with this scarred cheek!" Lian's heart became ice. She turned slowly to find a palace guard standing 3 paces away, his hand resting on the pommel of his bronze sword. The scar he mentioned was a mark from childhood, a fall from a tree that her mother had tended with honey and prayers. Now it had made her memorable. Now it had marked her for notice. "The Lord Chancellor wishes to speak with you," the guard said. It was not a request. Lian felt May's hand tighten on her arm, felt the older woman's terror transmit through that touch like fever through flesh. "I have done nothing wrong," Lian said, keeping her voice steady. "I am a weaver. I pay my taxes. I attend every ceremony." "The Lord Chancellor wishes to speak with you," the guard repeated, his expression unchanging. "You may come willingly, or you may be carried. Choose." There was no choice. There had never been a choice. That was the fundamental truth of life under the Shang. The gods had ordained kings, and kings had ordained everything else. To resist was to resist heaven itself, and heaven, so the priests insisted, could not be resisted. Lian released May's arm and stepped forward. She did not say goodbye. She did not promise to return. In that moment, she felt herself becoming one more name in a long list of forgettable tragedies. A young woman who had existed for 23 years, whose life had been unremarkable except for its ending. She would be processed, her name recorded on an oracle bone, her fate decided by priests reading cracks in heated shell and believing they saw the will of gods. The guard led her through winding streets that grew progressively wider and cleaner as they approached the palace district. Merchant stalls gave way to aristocratic compounds, their walls painted with scenes of ancient victories and divine favor. Lian passed a mural depicting King Tong, founder of the Shang dynasty, receiving his mandate from a dragon whose scales were real gold leaf pressed into plaster. The dragon's eyes seemed to follow her, judging, condemning. They entered the palace through a side gate used for servants and prisoners. The distinction between the two had grown increasingly blurred over the past decade of Tai Sin's reign. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with incense that couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of molten metal and human sweat. The foundries were close. Lord Chancellor Began waited in a small reception chamber, decorated with bronze vessels that probably represented hundreds of lives. He was a thin man with the scholarly stoop of someone who had spent decades bent over oracle bones and bureaucratic tablets. Unlike the king, his eyes held no divine certainty, only the weary calculation of a man managing an empire built on lies. "Leon of the Western Quarter," he said, consulting a wooden tablet. "Sister to Fung, deceased. Daughter of a farmer, also deceased. Trained as a weaver. 23 years of age. No living family. No debts. No criminal record." He looked up. "No one to miss you." The words hung in the air like a noose. "That is inaccurate, my lord," Leon heard herself say. "I have friends. You have no one," Began interrupted, but his tone was not cruel. If anything, he sounded tired. "That is not an insult, child. It is a fact I must record. Do you understand why you are here?"
"No," Themistocles replied calmly, his eyes never leaving the Corinthian's face. "I've created the only conditions under which we can win. Listen to me carefully, all of you, because your lives depend on understanding what I have accomplished." He pointed toward the Persian fleet, his arm steady and sure. "In open water, we die. This is not opinion or pessimism, it is mathematical fact. Their ships outnumber ours 3-1. Their archers can fill the sky with arrows while staying beyond the range of our javelins. Their fastest squadrons, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, can harry us from a distance, wearing us down until we break formation in exhaustion and confusion. In open water, Persian advantages are insurmountable." Now he gestured toward the strait, toward the narrow channel where Persian ships were already beginning to crowd together. "But here we force them to fight our way. Our triremes are heavier than theirs, built for ramming rather than maneuverability. Our crews are better trained in close combat. Our bronze rams will shatter their hulls, while their arrows fall uselessly into the sea. And most importantly, their vast fleet becomes not an advantage, but a deadly liability." He moved to draw in the sand, his fingers tracing out the tactical situation. "These waters are perhaps 2 kilometers wide at most. How many ships can engage effectively in such a confined space? 60? 80 at the absolute maximum? The rest must wait their turn, crowding together, getting in each other's way, unable to deploy the numerical superiority that should guarantee their victory." Mnesiphilus stepped forward, his ancient voice carrying the weight of authority. "He speaks truth. I have studied naval warfare for 50 years, and I tell you this. In narrow waters, discipline defeats numbers every time. The Persians have ships from a dozen different regions, speaking a dozen different languages, following a dozen different tactical doctrines. They will collide with each other as often as they engage us. Their coordination will collapse into chaos." "But they still outnumber us," another commander protested, though his voice lacked conviction now. "Do they?" Themistocles countered. "How many Persian ships can actually fight at once in these narrows? Perhaps 80 at most? How many Greek ships can we deploy in our best formation? 370. At any given moment in this battle, we will have local numerical superiority, despite their overall advantage. We can rotate fresh crews while theirs grow exhausted. We can withdraw damaged vessels and replace them with undamaged ones. They cannot. Their own vast numbers prevent it." Eurybiades was beginning to understand now, his tactical mind working through the implications. "You've turned their strength into weakness. Every advantage they have in open water becomes a disadvantage here." "Exactly. Their archers, useless when ships are locked together in ramming distance. Their superior speed, meaningless in waters so crowded that they can barely move. Their ability to surround and overwhelm, impossible when geography limits how many ships can engage simultaneously. I have not trapped us here to die. I have trapped them here to be slaughtered."
A new voice entered the discussion, clear and carrying authority, despite coming from one of the younger men present. Aristides the Just had returned from exile specifically to fight for Athens, and his reputation for integrity was beyond question throughout Greece. Men who disagreed with him still trusted him, which made his words carry special weight. I was at the south end of the strait at first light. I took a small boat to scout our situation. I saw Persian ships moving to block every exit, positioning themselves with clear intent to prevent any escape. Everything Themistocles says is true. We cannot retreat even if we wish to. The Persians have sealed every route. Our only choice is to fight here or to surrender without fighting. The weight of these words settled over the council like a heavy cloak. Surrender meant slavery for most, execution for the leaders, the end of Greek independence and democracy. It meant seeing their wives and daughters claimed by Persian nobles, their sons raised as soldiers for a foreign empire, their cities becoming provincial backwaters in a vast imperial machine that cared nothing for Greek culture or values. Slowly, one by one, the commanders nodded. They understood that fortune had carried them beyond the point where debate mattered. Themistocles had gambled with all their lives, and they could either accept his logic and fight with purpose, or reject it and die without achieving anything. "Then we fight," Eurybiades declared, his Spartan pragmatism accepting the inevitable. "May the gods favor the righteous and grant victory to free men over slaves of a tyrant king." "To battle stations," Themistocles ordered. "Captains, brief your crews. Tell them that every Persian advantage is nullified here. Tell them that we fight not for glory or revenge, but for the survival of everything we hold dear. Tell them that history will remember what happens in these waters today, that their children's children will speak their names with pride or shame depending on how we acquit ourselves." As the commanders dispersed to their ships, Themistocles allowed himself one moment of relief. He had convinced them. The Greeks would fight with unity and purpose rather than panic and despair. But the hardest part still lay ahead. Convincing men to fight was one thing. Actually defeating an enemy that still held massive advantages in resources and experience was entirely another. By mid-morning, both fleets were preparing for battle. The Persian ships began their advance into the straits, their oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm, their painted hulls gleaming in the sunlight. Each vessel carried a crew of 200, rowers, soldiers, archers, officers, representing the finest naval power ever assembled. They came from across Xerxes' vast empire, Phoenicians famous for their seamanship, Egyptians who had ruled the seas before Athens existed, Ionians who were themselves Greeks but fought under Persian banners, Cilicians, Carians, Lycians, each bringing their own traditions and tactics. From his hilltop, overlooking the strait, Xerxes sat on his portable throne to witness what he expected to be the final destruction of Greek resistance. His courtiers surrounded him, offering praise and flattery, predicting the glory that would be added to his already magnificent reputation. Scribes prepared to record the victory for posterity. Artists sketched the scene from monuments that would be erected from Susa to Memphis. This would be the moment when the troublesome Greeks finally bowed to Persian supremacy, when the last obstacle to complete domination of the known world was removed. On the Perilos, Themistocles moved among the ships, offering final words of encouragement, making last adjustments to the battle formation. He had divided the fleet into 3 squadrons. The Athenians under his own command on the left wing, where they would face the elite Phoenicians. The Spartans and Corinthians held the center, the most prestigious position, where the fiercest fighting was expected. The island states, Aegina, Megara, Epidaurus, and others, formed the right wing, positioned to prevent any Persian attempt to outflank the Greek line. Each captain knew his role, knew his target sector, knew that failure meant not just personal death, but the end of everything their civilization had achieved. Free men fighting for their homes against professional soldiers fighting for a distant king. The eternal question of whether free will could overcome organized tyranny was about to be answered with Brahms and blood. On the Paralos, Themistocles gathered his crew for final words. These were men he had sailed with for years, Athenians who had watched their city burn from these very shores, and now fought for nothing more than the hope that their children might someday see it rebuilt. They were farmers and merchants, craftsmen and scholars, citizens who had dropped tools and taken up oars because democracy demanded that free men defend their own freedom. Some of you have asked me why we fight when the odds seem so terrible, why we simply accept Persian rule and live to see another day. Let me tell you what I told the council at Athens before we evacuated the city and watched it burn. He paused, making sure every eye was upon him, that every man could see his face and understand that these were not empty words, but deeply held conviction.
The battle raged through the afternoon, but its outcome was decided in those first crucial hours when the Persian advance became a Persian disaster. The fleet that should have overwhelmed the Greeks through sheer numbers instead found itself trapped in a maritime cage of its own making, unable to deploy its full strength, unable to maneuver in the crowded waters, systematically destroyed by an opponent that should have been hopelessly outmatched. Individual moments of heroism and tragedy played out across the churning water. An Athenian trireme, its ram broken and its hull compromised, deliberately rammed itself into a Persian flagship in a final act of defiance, both ships sinking together in a deadly embrace. A Phoenician captain, his vessel surrounded and his crew dead or dying, set fire to his own ship rather than surrender, the flames spreading to nearby vessels and adding smoke to the chaos of battle. An Egyptian squadron, cut off from the main fleet, fought with desperate courage until every ship was either sunk or captured, their crews earning grudging respect even from the Greeks who killed them. The Corinthians, who had argued most vociferously against Themistocles' strategy, fought with particular fury, perhaps trying to prove their courage was not in doubt, even if their judgment had been questioned. Their center squadron held firm against repeated Persian assaults, their rams striking with precision, and their crews battling any enemy who dared attempt boarding actions. Adamiantas, the admiral who had called Themistocles a traitor, was wounded in the shoulder by a Persian arrow, but refused to leave his command post, his blood staining the deck as he continued to shout orders and encouragement to his men. The Spartans fought with their characteristic discipline, their ships moving in perfect formation despite the chaos, each maneuver executed with the precision of soldiers who understood that survival depended on every man doing his duty without question or hesitation. Their deep-voiced paean, the Spartan war song, carried across the water even in the midst of slaughter, a defiant assertion of Greek identity against the multinational Persian host. And the Athenians, who had the most to avenge, their burned city, their destroyed temples, their scattered families, fought with a fury that bordered on madness, taking risks no sane tactician would approve, pressing attacks even when prudence dictated withdrawal, adding Persian ship after Persian ship to the list of victories. By evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the waters of Salamis were choked with wreckage. Broken oars floated among splintered planks, bodies drifted face down in water that had turned from blue to murky brown with blood and debris. Oil from shattered lamps created rainbow patterns across the surface, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Of the 1,000 ships that had entered the strait that morning with confidence and certainty, less than half limped back to Phaleron, many of those damaged and barely seaworthy.
The rest were sunk, captured, or driven aground on hostile shores where their crews faced death or slavery. The Greek losses were significant but manageable, perhaps 40 ships destroyed outright, another 30 too damaged for further combat, a few hundred men dead or wounded. Against all odds, against an enemy that should have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers, they had won a victory so complete that it would be remembered for millennia, a victory that would become synonymous with the triumph of strategy over strength, of intelligence over brute force, of free men over imperial might. On the Perilos, exhausted and bloodied but alive, Themistocles allowed himself a moment of relief. His tunic was stained with blood, some his own from a minor cut across his forearm, most belonging to the Persian marine he had personally killed when an enemy ship had attempted to board. His throat was raw from shouting orders through hours of combat, every muscle ached with the strain of battle. But he was alive. His city had a future, and Greece would not bow to Persian rule. Around him, his crew was cheering, embracing, crying with the joy of men who had expected to die, but found themselves granted another dawn. Other ships took up the celebration, and soon the entire Greek fleet was singing the paean, the hymn of victory, their voices carrying across water, still littered with the evidence of slaughter. It was a sound of triumph mixed with grief, of relief mixed with exhaustion, of victory mixed with the knowledge of how close they had come to total annihilation. Eurybiades frowned Themistocles as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. The Spartan admiral's face was a mask of blood and exhaustion, his armor dented and scarred, but his eyes held a new respect that had not been there before the battle. "You were right," he said simply, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "About all of it. The trap, the tactics, the psychology. You saw the whole board while the rest of us were still trying to understand the individual pieces." "We were lucky," Themistocles replied, though they both knew luck had played only a small part in the day's events. "The gods favored us today. They favored free men over slaves of tyranny. The gods favored your planning and your courage. Don't diminish what you accomplished with false modesty." Eurybiades placed a hand on Themistocles' shoulder, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. "Athens should be proud of you. Greece should be proud of you. You saved us when no one else saw a path to salvation." "Athens is ashes," Themistocles said quietly, allowing a moment of genuine emotion to show through his mask of calculation. "But perhaps we've bought time for it to rise again. Perhaps our children will see the Acropolis rebuilt, the Agora restored, the democracy we created allowed to flourish without the shadow of Eastern conquest." "More than perhaps. After today, Xerxes knows Greece cannot be conquered easily. He will withdraw, mark my words. The god-king has been humbled, and even tyrants must acknowledge reality eventually." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun disappear beyond the western horizon, watching the stars begin to emerge in a sky cleared of battle smoke. Around them the fleet was anchoring for the night, tending to wounded, repairing damaged ships, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. But for this one moment, they allowed themselves to simply exist, to feel the weight of survival, to understand that they had participated in something that would echo through history. In the Persian camp, the mood was funereal. The vast army that had seemed invincible just days ago now felt the weight of defeat settling upon it like a shroud. Xerxes sat on his throne in silence, staring at nothing. His magnificent robe somehow seemed less splendid in defeat. The golden crown on his head looked like a burden rather than a symbol of power. Around him, his advisors maintained careful silence, each acutely aware that kings in anguish seek someone to blame, and the line between advisor and scapegoat was often thin enough to dissolve entirely. The scale of the disaster was still being tallied, but the basic facts were undeniable. More than half the fleet was destroyed or captured, thousands of sailors and marines were dead or missing. The morale of the entire army had been shaken by watching what should have been an easy victory turn into catastrophic defeat. And perhaps worst of all, the myth of Persian invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of conquest, had been shattered in a single afternoon. It was Artemisia who finally spoke, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a knife through cloth. "Great king, this defeat, while painful, is not final. Your army remains undefeated. The land forces that took Athens, that crushed the Spartans at Thermopylae, are still the finest military machine in the known world. Your empire stands strong across 3 continents. One naval battle, however catastrophic, does not determine the outcome of a war that has barely begun." Xerxes turned to look at her, and in her eyes she saw not just anger, but something more dangerous, wounded pride mixed with dawning understanding. "They made a fool of me," he said softly, his voice carrying the particular danger of controlled fury. "This Themistocles, he sent his slave with lies wrapped in truth, and I believed them. I believed them because they told me what I wanted to hear. I positioned my fleet exactly where he wanted it, walked my ships into his trap like a shepherd guiding lambs to slaughter, and thought myself clever all the while."
"You made decisions based on reasonable intelligence," Mardonius offered carefully, trying to find words that would deflect blame without seeming to excuse failure. "The message was verified by our own scouts. Any commander would have made the same choices given the same information." "But I am not any commander," Xerxes replied, his voice hardening. "I am the king of kings, the ruler of the known world, the chosen of Ahura Mazda himself. I am descended from Cyrus the Great, from Darius who conquered the Scythians and punished the Ionians for their rebellion. And I was outwitted by a Greek politician, a man whose name I barely knew before today, whose city I burned thinking it would break Greek resistance. Instead, I have created a legend who will haunt Persian dreams for generations." The truth of this assessment hung in the air, undeniable and bitter. The god-king, whose word was absolute law across an empire stretching thousands of miles, had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior cunning. The psychological impact of this realization would reverberate through Persian councils for years to come, would embolden rebels and encourage resistance, would make every future campaign more difficult because subject peoples would remember that the empire could be beaten. Ariabignes, who had survived the battle, but whose flagship had been captured and whose best captains were dead or missing, spoke with the hollowness of a man who had watched his life's work destroyed in a single afternoon. "What are your orders, great king? Do we regroup and attack again? Do we withdraw to Phaleron and reassess? The navy is damaged but not destroyed. Given time, we could—" "No." Xerxes stood, and with visible effort, reassembled his imperial bearing, pulling the mask of divine kingship back over the merely human face of defeat. "We withdraw. The army will march north before winter closes the passes. I will return to Asia to ensure stability in the empire. Already I can imagine the rumors that will spread, the ambitious men who will see this defeat as opportunity. Mardonius, you will remain with a picked force, winter in friendly territory, and when spring comes, you will complete the conquest on land where our advantages remain decisive." It was a face-saving solution, though everyone present understood its true implications. Salamis had broken Persian naval supremacy. Without control of the seas, Xerxes could not supply a massive army indefinitely in hostile territory. Without naval support, his coastal cities and supply depots were vulnerable to Greek raids. The invasion of Greece, which had seemed inevitable and unstoppable just hours before, was now in serious doubt. The empire would continue, would remain powerful,
but the dream of adding all of Greece to its provinces had died in the waters of Salamis. As the council dispersed to implement these painful orders, as officers began the process of organizing a retreat that would take weeks and cost thousands more lives to cold and hunger, Artemisia approached Xerxes one final time. She chose her words carefully, speaking not as subject to king, but as one honest warrior to another. "Great king, one question remains. What of the slave, the Sisinus, the one who brought Themistocles' message? He still lives, held in our camp under guard. What would you have done with him?" Xerxes considered this, his face unreadable. By all rights, Sisinus should be executed, impaled or flayed, or subjected to any of the creative torments Persian justice reserved for traitors and deceivers. He had been instrumental in leading Persia into disaster, had played his role perfectly in the scheme that had cost thousands of lives and humiliated the empire before the watching world. But to kill him would be to admit publicly that the message had been false, that Xerxes had been deceived, and that the defeat at Salamis was the result of cunning rather than mere misfortune or the whims of hostile gods. It would transform the narrative from "we were unlucky in battle" to "we were manipulated by our enemies," a much more dangerous story for imperial prestige. "Release him," Xerxes said, finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Return him to his master, unharmed. Tell him—" The king paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that this message would be repeated, analyzed, discussed for years. "Tell him that Themistocles is fortunate to have such loyal servants, and tell him that his master has made an enemy who will not forget this day, who will carry the memory of this defeat to his grave and beyond. Someday, somewhere, accounts will be balanced. Persian memory is long, and vengeance is patient." It was a threat wrapped in respect, acknowledgement of defeat wrapped in promise of future retribution. It allowed Xerxes to maintain his dignity while still admitting, in the most indirect way possible, that he had been outmaneuvered by a superior strategist. And it ensured that the story of Salamis would include this final detail: the god-king releasing his deceiver unharmed, a gesture that could be interpreted as either mercy or calculated psychological warfare. 3 days after the battle, when the Persian retreat was well underway and the immediate danger had passed, Sisinus returned to Salamis. He came openly, rowing his small boat across waters now patrolled by Greek ships, past floating wreckage that still bobbed in the gentle swells, past bodies being collected for burial or cremation, depending on whether they were Greek or Persian. He had been well treated by his captors, fed and clothed and given safe passage, which only confirmed Themistocles' read of Xerxes' psychology. The king valued his own pride too much to admit the full extent of his manipulation. When Sisinus reached the beach where Themistocles waited, the strategist embraced him like a brother. All pretense of master-servant relationship temporarily abandoned in the relief of survival and success. "You survived," Themistocles said, his voice thick with emotion that he didn't bother trying to hide. "I didn't dare hope. Not truly. I knew the plan required your sacrifice, and I made peace with that burden. But you survived." "The Persians let me go," Sisinus explained, his weathered face showing exhaustion but also a certain satisfaction. "I think Xerxes understood exactly what had happened, but couldn't admit it without acknowledging his own error. So he chose to treat the message as genuine, to preserve his dignity. He even sent a message through me, something about how you've made an enemy who will not forget this day." Pride, Themistocles murmured, his tactical mind already analyzing even this final detail. It's the weakness of powerful men everywhere and in every age. They cannot bear to be seen as fools, so they compound their foolishness by denying it, by creating elaborate narratives that protect their self-image at the expense of truth. They walked together along the shore as the sun set. Two men who had gambled everything on a desperate stratagem, and won against impossible odds. Around them, the Greek camp was slowly transforming from military desperation to cautious celebration. Ships were being repaired with wood salvaged from Persian wrecks. Wounded were being tended by healers and priests. Stories were being told and retold, each retelling adding new layers of heroism and divine intervention, transforming the messy reality of battle into the clean narrative of legend. "What are your orders, great king?" Sisinus asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone whose whole purpose had been defined by a single mission now completed. Themistocles gazed out across the water towards the distant mainland where Persian campfires still dotted the hills, marking the slow withdrawal of an army that thought it would spend winter in a conquered land. "Now," he said, his voice tired, but it acknowledged the cost of his victory. "Now we've bought time. Xerxes will withdraw most of his forces because he cannot supply them here without naval supremacy. But he'll leave an army under Mardonius, perhaps 50,000 men, enough to threaten us, but not enough to require constant supply by sea. Next summer we'll have to fight again, this time on land, at a place called Plataea, if my intelligence is correct. But Salamis has shown that Persia can be beaten. That knowledge is worth more than any tactical victory. It's given Greece hope, shown that free men
Fighting for their homes can defeat professional soldiers fighting for imperial glory. And you? What will you do?" Themistocles smiled, but it was a tired expression that acknowledged the cost of his victory. "What I've always done. I'll scheme and plot and manipulate. I'll build support in Athens for a navy that can dominate these waters permanently. I'll make alliances and break them as circumstances require. I'll be the villain in some men's stories and the hero in others, because that's the burden of men who change history. We do what must be done, and then we live with the consequences, knowing that necessity and morality don't always align perfectly." He turned to face Sisinus directly. "But first, I'm going to keep my promise. You're free. Officially, legally, completely free. And more than that, I'm going to make sure everyone knows your role in this victory. The assembly will honor you. Your name will be recorded alongside mine in the histories. Your children, should you choose to have them, will be Athenian citizens with all the rights and privileges that entails." Sisinus felt something catch in his throat, an emotion too complex for simple naming. "I was born a slave in Persia. I will die a free man in Athens. That is enough, more than enough." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun disappear and the stars emerge, listening to the songs of victory floating across the water. Both understood that they had been part of something that would resonate through the centuries, that the desperate gambit in the Straits of Salamis would be studied by strategists and celebrated by poets long after both of them were dust. Far to the east, beyond the horizon and the mountains and the vast expanses of the Persian Empire, Xerxes was beginning his long march back to Susa and Persepolis. He would never return to Greece, would never again command a massive invasion force against the stubborn city-states that had defied him. The tide of Persian expansion, which had seemed irresistible, had been turned back by cunning and courage in the narrow waters that would forever bear the name Salamis. The consequences of that single battle would echo through centuries. Athens would rise to unprecedented heights of culture and philosophy, protected by the naval dominance that Themistocles' victory had established. Democracy would survive and flourish, becoming a model that would influence political thought for millennia.
The idea that free citizens could govern themselves, that power should come from the people rather than from divine right of kings, would prove more durable and more revolutionary than any military conquest. But in that moment, Xerxes knew only the bitter taste of defeat. He had learned a lesson that every tyrant eventually learns, that control is an illusion, that even absolute power can be undermined by those who think more cleverly, that the most dangerous weapon in human history is not the sword or the spear or the bow, but the human mind unleashed from the constraints of fear and servitude. In the years that followed, the story of the battle would be told and retold, becoming legend even in the lifetimes of those who fought there. Playwrights would dramatize it in the theaters of Athens. Historians would analyze it in scrolls that would survive millennia. Philosophers would use it as an example of how intelligence could triumph over brute force, how strategy could overcome superior numbers, how the careful manipulation of an enemy's expectations could turn their own strengths into fatal weaknesses. But those who knew the truth, those who had stood in that command tent and listened to Themistocles explain his desperate gambit, who had watched Sikinas row into darkness carrying a lie that would become Greece's salvation, understood that Salamis had been won not just through divine intervention or martial prowess alone, but through the calculated deception of one man who understood that sometimes the greatest weapon is not strength, but the appearance of weakness, not confrontation, but misdirection.
The day after the battle dawned clear and bright, as if the gods themselves wished to illuminate what had been accomplished. Themistocles stood on the highest point of Salamis Island, looking out over water that still bore evidence of the previous day's slaughter. From this vantage, he could see the entire strait laid out like a map, could trace the movements that had led to victory, could understand with hindsight how close they had come to disaster at a dozen different moments. A voice behind him broke his reverie. "The council requests your presence, strategist. They wish to discuss the future." Themistocles turned to see young Cimon, son of the great Miltiades who had won at Marathon, a man who would someday be his political rival, but was today just another Greek grateful for survival. The future. As if we can predict such things after what we've just experienced. "They look to you for guidance," Cimon said carefully. "You've proven yourself the wisest among us. Your strategy saved Greece when all seemed lost." "My strategy exploited Persian pride and Greek desperation," Themistocles corrected. "I saw a path where others saw only walls. But wisdom? That's something different. Wisdom would be understanding that victories create their own problems, that success breeds jealousy as surely as failure breeds despair." He began walking down the hillside toward the beach where the council was assembling, Cimon falling into step beside him. "Tell me, young Cimon, what do you think they want to discuss? Strategy for the coming year? How to rebuild Athens? Distribution of captured Persian ships and treasure?" "All of those things, probably. But mostly I think they want reassurance. They want you to tell them that the worst is over, that we've broken Persian power permanently, that they can return to their homes in farms and workshops without fear." "Then I will disappoint them," Themistocles said quietly, "because the truth is more complex and more dangerous than simple victory. Xerxes is wounded, yes, but not destroyed. He leaves an army under Mardonius that still outnumbers any force we can field. The Persian Empire is vast and patient. They think in terms of decades and centuries, not seasons and years. And most dangerous of all, we Greeks will now begin fighting among ourselves over credit for this victory, over how to share the spoils, over who should lead and who should follow." They reached the beach where the council had assembled. Representatives from every Greek city-state that had contributed ships stood in small groups, their conversations falling silent as Themistocles approached. He saw calculation in their eyes, respect mixed with wariness, gratitude mixed with the first stirrings of political rivalry.
The bonds forged in desperate battle would not long survive the peace. Eurybiades called the council to order, his Spartan voice carrying across the assembly. "Strategist Themistocles, Athens honors you, and Greece is in your debt. We gather to determine our next course of action. The Persian naval fleet is broken, but their army remains. What do you advise?" Themistocles moved to the center of the assembly, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. This was the moment when victory could be properly secured or squandered, when the advantage gained through blood and cunning could be pressed or lost through complacency and division. "Honored representatives," he began, his voice carrying the authority earned through proven success. "We have won a great victory, but we must not mistake a battle for a war. Yesterday, we proved that Persia can be beaten. Today, we must ensure that they remain beaten, that this victory becomes the foundation for lasting security rather than a brief moment of relief before renewed disaster." He paused, gauging their reactions, seeing hope and fear and exhaustion in equal measure. "First, we must acknowledge what we have achieved. Persian naval supremacy is broken. They cannot supply a massive army in Greece without controlling these waters. Xerxes himself will withdraw, because he cannot risk leaving such forces here through winter, while potentially rebellious satraps plot in his absence. But Mardonius will remain, with perhaps 50,000 men, enough to threaten any single Greek city, but not enough to conquer all of us if we remain united." "United," someone muttered from the crowd. As if that were simple. "It's not simple," Themistocles agreed. "It's never been simple. We are Greeks. We love our independence, our local loyalties, our petty rivalries more than we love the abstract concept of Hellenic unity. But we must learn, quickly and completely, that unity is not a choice, but a necessity. Divided, we will be destroyed piecemeal. United, we will be invincible." He turned to address different sections of the assembly in turn. "Athens must be rebuilt, but not just as it was. We must build walls, massive walls that will make our city defensible even without the fleet that is our true strength. And we must expand that fleet, add to it, make it so dominant that no enemy will dare challenge our control of these waters. Sparta must understand that land power alone is insufficient in this new age. The battle was won at sea, not on the plains where Spartan hoplites are supreme. Our alliance must reflect this reality. Sparta commands the army, Athens commands the navy, and together we are stronger than the sum of our parts." It was a bold vision, and he could see both enthusiasm and resistance in the faces watching him. Some understood immediately what he proposed: a permanent alliance under dual leadership, a new form of Greek cooperation that transcended traditional city-state isolation. Others saw only Athenian ambition, a scheme to dominate Greece under the guise of protecting it. Adeimantus, the Corinthian admiral, stepped forward. His shoulder was bandaged from the arrow wound he had received, but his voice was strong. "You speak of unity, Themistocles, but what you describe sounds like Athenian hegemony with Spartan muscle to back it. How do we know this alliance won't simply replace Persian tyranny by Athenian tyranny?" It was a fair question, and Themistocles had expected it. "You don't know. You can't know. You can only judge by actions rather than words. So judge me by this. Yesterday, I could have kept my strategy secret, could have let the council continue debating while I executed my plan alone, could have claimed all credit for myself and Athens. Instead, I shared the victory with all who fought. I gave Sparta command of the center where glory is traditionally won. I positioned every city's ships where they could contribute and earn honor." He met Adeimantus' eyes directly. "I am ambitious, yes. I want Athens to be great, to be remembered, to lead rather than follow.
But I also understand that no city, no matter how powerful, can stand alone against the forces arrayed against us. We need each other. That's not sentiment, it's mathematics. And if you doubt my word, doubt my intentions, I accept that. But don't doubt the logic of what I propose. The debate continued for hours, voices raised in argument and agreement, alliances forming and reforming as different fractions tried to secure the best terms for their cities. But gradually, through exhaustion and necessity, and the undeniable evidence of yesterday's success, a consensus emerged. Greece would remain united, at least for now. The fleet would be maintained and expanded. Preparations would begin for the inevitable land battle that would come when Mardonius advanced in spring. As the council dispersed, Mnesophilis approached Themistocles with a knowing smile. You manipulated them as skillfully as you manipulated Xerxes. The difference is, they'll eventually realize it and hate you for it. I know, Themistocles replied quietly. That's the price of leadership that actually leads, rather than simply following popular opinion. I'll be exiled eventually, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, but inevitably. Democrats distrust anyone who makes decisions without asking permission first. But by the time they exile me, Athens will be so strong, so secure, that even my enemies will benefit from what I've built. And that's enough for you, to be right but unpopular, to save Greece and then be cast out by those you saved? Themistocles looked out over the water, toward the horizon where the future waited, unknowable and full of possibility. It has to be enough, because the alternative is watching everything burn while trying to maintain popularity. I'd rather be a hated savior than a beloved fool.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.